we were using for the Epic of Eden. We have those cleared out and set, so if you want to use that for the handouts we have in our history of Israel, you can grab your folder. I also have the handouts up there. During our review time, if I could get some help from some people to pass the handout for this week out, maybe Zach and Dad, could you help them with that? They're right up there on the... But yeah, so those are there to help keep track of everything. And right next to that, we have everyone's set of their Epic of Eden notes. So if you wanted to hang on to those, you could go right next to the box of folders. There's a box of papers with all those in there. So if you're like, hey, I remember we did the Epic of Eden, but I can't find my notes, it's probably because they're in the box up here. So take a look through that if you wanted to hang on to those. But as we review at the very beginning, I talked about there are 4 parts of Israel's history. Could be divided into 4 major sections. Can anyone name one of those for me? Birth and development is one of those sections. Yeah, there are 4 major sections that you can divide the history of Israel into. First one is birth and development, and that's the time of Abraham to Jacob, that time of the patriarchs, all the way from creation to Moses. All those times where you had Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all the way through their exile, and even at start of the exile out of Egypt, it begins it ends the development where they get the law. Then we begin the next stage, which is victory and expansion. Exactly. That's the time of Joshua, the conquest, the judges, the subjugation of the land of Canaan, all the way through the time of the kings, all the way through the United Kingdom of King Solomon, where Israel was constantly expanding its borders and growth until it reached its maximum size. Then we have the kingdom split, and the next section begins. Does anyone know what that one is called? Yeah, decline and defeat, or divide and defeat. Both of those work, and that's the time of the divided kingdom. You had the kingdom of Judah in the south, kingdom of Israel in the north, and the nation was divided and ultimately conquered by Babylon. And that's the time of the exile that we talk about, when they were in Babylon, the kingdom of Judah taken into exile. And after that time of exile, we have the last section of the history, which is called what? Return and redemption. That's exactly right. It's the time of Ezra, Nehemiah, the return, the reconstruction of Jerusalem, and ultimately takes you through to the time when Jesus comes, the ultimate fulfillment of God's plan that he started all the way back in creation. As Dad always said, the Bible is a story of a loving God trying to restore a right relationship with mankind, and that's what the history of Israel shows us as we go through, is God's plan unfolding all the way to the introduction of Jesus and his death, burial, and resurrection that offered the forgiveness. But as we stand right now, we are in the section of victory and expansion, and we've been talking about a king. Does anyone know what king we've been talking about? We've talked a lot about him. We're going to finish up his life this week. King Saul. King Saul. That's who we've been talking about. He's the first king of Israel. God chose him because the people demanded a king. God didn't want to give it to him, but he said, Samuel was like, God, they're asking for one, they're demanding one. He says, all right, I'm going to give them a king. And he chooses Saul, kind of forced by the people to choose Saul. Chooses Saul. Saul starts off as a good king, but he has 3 major blunders early on. We've talked about them. Does anyone remember those 3 blunders, 3 failings that he had? What was one of them, Mama? You're right. The biggest one, the Amalekites. Exactly. Good job, Mama. The Amalekites, that was the people group. That was his biggest one. The one that he's finally rejected by God for was his failure to destroy the Amalekite people. God told him through Samuel, he said, go destroy this whole nation, kill everything, leave nothing alive. Then Saul says, all right, I'll go do that. He goes, and after they kill all the soldiers and most of the people, they start to see they got a lot of good animals, a lot of good sheep, good goats, good cows. Why don't we just take the good stuff? And we'll take the king prisoner too. So he does all that, and he says, I'm going to sacrifice it to the Lord. And Samuel says, the Lord wants obedience, not sacrifice, gets mad at him and says, God's done with you. That's the big blunder. There were two other ones before that. Does anyone remember the two before? Exactly. That's another really big one, is he was impatient. It was one of the wars they fought with the Philistines. His army was amassed. The Philistines had a bigger army. He was waiting because Samuel said, wait 7 days and I'll come and make the sacrifice. So he's waiting, and that 7 days go by. No Samuel. His army's full of fear. He's full of fear, and people start retreating. And he says, fine, I'll do it myself. He gets the sacrifice, kills it, and right after he does that, here comes Samuel around the corner, says, whoa, what are you doing? That's not your job, that's my job. Tells him, you got to stay in your lane, just focus on what God wants you to do. Because as we know, there are three major jobs in this type of government. You have the king, who's supposed to help everyone follow the rules. You have the prophet, who speaks from God to the people. And you have the priest, who speak from the people to God. And Saul was trying to do the job of a prophet instead of the job of a king, and that got him in trouble. And there was one other blunder he made, and he did it to himself. This one is one we covered briefly. It's one we sometimes forget about. Does anyone remember what it was? It was not killing Jonathan. Exactly. Good job, Funston. That's what it was. It's one we sometimes glance over, but in one of his fights with the Philistines, he had made a promise before God that none of his men would eat until he had exacted vengeance on the Philistine army. As they're fighting, Jonathan didn't hear this command. He takes a big bite of honey in the middle of the battle, and it says his eyes were lit up and he was full of energy, and he goes on and kills a whole bunch of Philistines as they retreat. They all get back together, and somebody says, uh-oh, somebody ate food. They go through this long process, and Saul says, as God is my witness, I will kill whoever has done this, even if it's my own son. They go through the process. They find out Jonathan was the one who ate, and he says, well, I got to kill him now. And before he can, all the soldiers say, whoa, King Saul, Jonathan brought us victory in this fight. Why should we kill him? Saul is afraid of his soldiers because there's a lot of them and they don't want to kill Jonathan. So he says, all right, we're not going to kill him. Those are three big blunders that he made in his career as king that he's known for. And that's the reason, this constant disobedience to God is the reason he was rejected as king. And then as we continued, we saw the introduction of David. And David was chosen for a specific reason. There was a reason David was chosen. Does anyone remember that reason? He was good looking. He was good looking, but that wasn't the reason God chose him. His heart. Yeah, as Samuel was told, he was good looking though. I mean, yeah. But it was his heart. His heart is what God wanted. Because he said he went to the sons of Jesse and started looking, and all the sons that came up, Samuel said, now that guy looks like a king. But God said, no, that's not who I want. Man looks at the outside, I look at the inside. David's heart was what God wanted, because David had a heart to follow God. So David's anointed. We saw he fought Goliath, and what did he do after he hit Goliath with the rock? He hits Goliath in the head with the rock, and he goes up and does what to his body? Cuts his head off with Goliath's own sword. One of my favorite parts, because after he cuts Goliath's head off, he drags it around that whole day. He carries Goliath's head around with him the rest of that day. Yeah, he brought the head with him. He's brought before Saul afterwards, and it says he's still holding the head of the Philistine whenever he's brought before Saul. Ridiculous and incredibly violent. Sometimes I love the Bible. It gets that primal urge of violence, you get. Yeah, it was that dashboard, hanging over the dashboard. But as the time went on, David became more and more famous. And Saul began to become afraid again of David. Now, why? As we saw, Saul starts to chase David, tries to kill him a few different times. Does anyone remember why Saul was trying to kill David? He says it a few different times.
Because of the jealousy. Because they were saying that Saul only killed 1,000 and David killed 10,000.
Yeah, it started there, and it gets worse because as time goes on, he realizes the Spirit of the Lord was with David, not himself. And he knew whoever the Spirit of the Lord was with, they are going to be king. So as he's chasing David, he even tells Jonathan one of the times, he says, "Why do you care so much about David? Don't you realize if he lives, you will never be king?" So he knows David is going to be the next king, and he's got to kill him. And that's kind of where we left off last week. We left off with Saul chasing David to a town called Nob. Does anyone remember what happened at the town of Nob? Mama? A bunch of priests were killed, exactly. Because the priests helped David. They gave him the bread of the presence, which David shouldn't have had in the first place. But he was hungry and told the priest, "Listen, our men they've followed all the laws. They're ritually clean. We need food." So he gave him the bread. And also, for whatever reason, this priest had Goliath's sword. So he gave him that sword too. It doesn't explain how the sword got there, but the priest had it and gave it to David. But that was what they did. Saul finds out and he goes to kill him. And there's another important thing I want to mention here. I didn't realize it last week. It might have been Funston who pointed it out to me at the end of the lesson last week, but Nob, that town, is incredibly important because that is where the tabernacle was. That town became the center of worship to God because during the time of Judges, Shiloh, where the tabernacle was destroyed, and they moved it to the town of Nob. So not only did Saul kill off a bunch of Israelite priests, his own people, he killed his own people, but he also killed everyone who was serving at the tabernacle, meaning most likely he killed the high priest as well, showing again his delusion, if you will, of he's so afraid and so prideful, thinking, "I'm the king, I can do what I want, David's going to take my throne, I can't let that happen." He doesn't even care that he's attacking the people of God. He kills the priests working at the tabernacle, which also, if we remember, the Ark of the Covenant was not there at this time. It was at Abinadab's house, sitting in a barn, waiting for somebody to come collect it. But Saul, in his angst to kill David, kills his own people. And that's where we're going to pick up this week. As we see, we have David on the run. Saul's massacre, that was just the beginning. And if we pick up in chapter 23, I'm going to read it first, verses 1 through 6. It says this: "When David was told, 'Look, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are looting the threshing floors,' he inquired the Lord, saying, 'Shall I go and attack the Philistines?' The Lord answered him, 'Go, attack the Philistines and save the town.' But David's men were saying to him, 'Here in Judah we are afraid. How much more then if we go against the Philistine forces?'" So they're saying there, "Listen, I know God wants you to go fight these Philistines, but we're on the run, my friend. Saul's trying to kill us. We're already scared. Now you want us to go to battle?" So David again inquires the Lord, just to be sure, "God, is this what you want?" And the Lord answers him, "Go down, for I am giving the Philistines into your hands." So David and his men went to Keilah. They fought the Philistines, carried off their livestock. He inflicted heavy losses on the Philistines and saved the people. And then the last verse there says, "Now Abiathar, son of Ahimelech, had brought the ephod down with him when he fled to David." So David is now traveling with the only survivor from the massacre at Nob. This guy he has with him is going to become the next high priest, and he has with him the priestly garment. That ephod it talks about is the high priest robe. And since there's no Ark of the Covenant, we'll see a lot of times when David or others are trying to inquire the Lord, since they can't bring the Ark of the Covenant with them, they'll have the ephod of the high priest that they'll use as that ritual, that symbol of holiness. So David is traveling now with a priest who has the high priestly robes. So all these times he's inquiring the Lord, he's using that as a way to help talk to God, as that's what that is for. So now we see David, while on the run, a criminal against Israel is what he's labeled as by Saul, is still defending the people and doing the will of God. And I find it interesting here. He hears this army of Philistines is attacking. He goes. Saul does not this time. The king does not take his army to fight them. He's too worried about chasing down David to go fight these Philistines. Until, as we continue the story, it says David goes, he saves this town from massacre. They have this great victory. Him and his men are hiding out inside this town. And then Saul hears David is at Keilah. Saul hears through the grapevine, David is at this town he just saved. So now Saul gets together his army and starts to march towards this town, which is very interesting. Here we have, he wasn't going to go march against the Philistines, but he'll go kill David. That's his goal. So David then hears Saul's chasing me again, and we're going to see this kind of repeated multiple times. Saul's on his way towards me. He inquires to God. He says, God, are these people going to turn me over to Saul? That's his question to God, because he's like, I love my kin here, love my fellow Israelites, but if the king wants me, will they give me over to him? God says, yes. He's on his way down. He's going to come to this town, and they're going to hand you over to him. So David says, all right, we're leaving. So I love it. David gets his men together before Saul gets there. They run out of the town. Saul hears that he's gone to the caves of En-Gedi and says, well, we're going to follow him. So as we go from here, we see Saul is chasing David through these caves. And David is on the run. He's fighting Philistines wherever he can, which is interesting. But he's also on the run from Saul through these caves. And we get to chapter 24, which is where we first see a major difference between Saul and David. Saul, as we have seen, was afraid and prideful. Those are the two things we learn from Saul's life. He was full of fear and full of pride. And it's contrasted to David, who was courageous and humble. And David's humility is seen so clearly in two instances where he did not kill Saul when given the chance. We're going to read those. David had the heart God wanted, unlike Saul, and this contrast is seen clearly in 1 Samuel chapter 24, verses 3 through 7. Dad, you want to read that for us?
Then he came to the sheep pens along the way, and a cave was there. And Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. The men said, this is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy to your hand, and you will deal with him as you wish. Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off the corner of Saul's robe. Afterwards, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off the corner of the robe. He said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lift my hand against him, for he is the anointed of the Lord.
Right there is some humility. See, David, on the run, was hiding in a cave. Saul and his army chasing them, come to this cave. Now Saul has to take a poop. That's what it means. It's kind of potty talk, but let's get real here. Saul's got to poop. So Saul goes into this cave to relieve himself, little nicer terms. And as he's doing that, David and all his guys are saying, David, look, he's at your mercy. Go get him. Go kill him. Because David and all his men knew God anointed me king. Now I can kill the former king and take my place. So David goes up and he decides, I'm not going to kill him. I'm just going to cut off a corner of the robe. And he does that, and he's conscience-stricken. He didn't even lay a finger on Saul. He didn't hurt him in any way. All he did was cut a piece of robe off him. And his conscience hits him hard, says, I can't do this. God has chosen me to be the next king, but right now he is the Lord's anointed still. Because Saul was anointed and chosen by God, and he says he's still the anointed king. I'm not going to kill him. This man is being hunted like a dog and decides he's still God's chosen. The humility he has here in reverence for the Lord is such that he knows I'm chosen, but he was chosen first, and God will deal with him however he wants. I'm going to stay in my lane. That's why we see the vengeance is mine, I will repay, declares the Lord. He knows God will avenge me for what Saul has done to me. I'm just going to remain faithful. So after he cuts the rope, he sneaks back to his men. Saul finishes up, goes out of the cave, and David comes out and says, "Look here, Saul, I could have killed you. Why do you hunt me?" He calls him father, because as we remember, David was married to Saul's youngest daughter. Saul was his father-in-law. They are family. And he says, "Father, why are you trying to kill me?" He says, "Oh, my son, I'm so sorry. Come back with me. Everything is forgiven." And he says, "No, it's okay. Just go home." So Saul goes home. Saul goes home, and we're going to skip over chapter 25 for a second to continue to see David's humility. If we go to chapter 26, guess what's happening again? Anyone, take a guess. Somebody raise their hand and guess what Saul's doing right here. Chasing David, exactly. It's been, I don't know, a month, maybe 2 months. We don't know how long it was. But Saul, again, is trying to kill David. And Saul has this huge army amassed. They're chasing David. And it's nighttime. Everyone pitches tents and lays down for the night. David looks over the hill and sees all of Saul's army is asleep. Saul himself is asleep in his tent. So David and one of his guys sneak down into Saul's camp. And if you could read 26 verses 1 through 8, or 8 through 12.
Abishai said to David, "Today God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Now let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of my spear. I won't strike him twice." But David said to Abishai, "Don't destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? As surely as the Lord lives," he said, "the Lord himself will strike him. Either his time will come and he will die, or he will go into battle and perish. But the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. Now get a spear and water jug that is near your head, and let's go." So David took the spear and water jug near Saul's head, and they left. No one saw or knew about it, nor did anyone wake up. They were all sleeping because the Lord had put them in a deep sleep.
Again, David has Saul at his mercy. And he says, "Don't hurt him. The Lord will deal with him." Again, the humility David shows and the reverence for this position of king and God's anointed king is so great. This is why God chose David. Because see, it's not about the outside, it's about the inside. David's heart and in his spirit, he was trying to live for God. Does he do it all right? No, and we're going to see later as we look at the life of David, he has a few blunders of his own. But in his core personality, in his core self, he wanted to please God. So much so that again, another time, Saul's chasing him. He says, "No, we're not going to kill him." Instead, they take Saul's spear, the king's spear, and his water bucket. They go a hill over. They put it in the ground, and he yells out to the king and all his army, says, "Hey guys, wake up, look what I've got here. Again, I could have killed you, but I didn't." And they have a whole conversation where he talks about, "Oh, the Lord forgive me, come home, David, again." And Saul says, "You can cross in front, you're good." "Oh, you're good." Yeah. And David again says, "No, I'm not gonna come home with you." And it ends with Saul saying this to David. It says, "Then Saul said to David, 'May you be blessed, my son David. You will do great things and surely triumph.'" So even Saul recognizes David's heart here. He knows that David is the one the Lord wants. And I have to imagine Saul's internal self is wrestling this battle of, man, I wouldn't have acted like that. If I got to a camp and I saw David asleep on the floor, I would have killed him in a heartbeat. But David does not do that because he knows God will repay. So those are the two instances we see of David's courage and humility. Because it takes courage, again, to wake up a whole army of people hunting you to say, "Look, I could have killed you, but I didn't." Because they could all wake up, grab swords, and come chase you down and probably kill you. And it's also a lot of humility to recognize God's chosen position of king is not something that I'm going to overthrow. God will deal with Saul, and I'll have my time. He's so patient in this, and we see David's patience versus Saul's impatience. What did we talk about? Saul couldn't wait 7 days. He couldn't wait 7 days to go into battle, but David's waited years to be king. It's an amazing contrast between their two characters. But we are going to back up a bit, because before this, David has another encounter. And this one, again, kind of shows David's a little bit of his impatience, but he ends up in the right. Because David, as we talked about, was fighting Philistines left and right across Israel, defending his people during this time. And one of those people was a man named Nabal. And Nabal was a sheep herder. And it was time for his sheep to come in and be sheared, and they would butcher some to get meat. You know, the time of harvest was about. And it was the same area where David was. So all of his shepherds would see David and his men. And all the Philistines wouldn't come into this guy's territory because David and his guys were there. So this guy Nabal, his flocks were protected, his shepherds were safe, and as we look at it, none of David's men touched any of his stuff. Because in this time, you know, if a sheep goes missing here and there, that happens. So David could have very easily gone to this guy's sheep and taken 5 or 6 of them and killed anyone who stood in his way. But he didn't. He was a good guy. He was striving to live how God wanted him to live. So he respected this guy's boundaries. But now, the time of harvest, David and his men are hungry. They need some supplies. So David sends some emissaries to Nabal, and they get up there, and he tells them, hey, look at what we've done. We've protected your stuff. None of your servants were mistreated by my men. None of your sheep were taken. Everything's been safe. Can you give us some supplies? And Nabal's response is pretty much, go away. I don't want you. He says, who is this David, son of Jesse? Why do I have to help him? What has he ever done for me? He's very angry, like immediately. He doesn't want to help in any way. He says, no, leave me alone. So David's soldiers, they come back and they report, they say, we went and told him what you said, but he basically told us to get off his land or he's going to kill us. That's essentially his response. So now David's angry. He says, we're going to get all guys together. We're going to go to his town, and we're going to kill every man in that village. All of them, all of his people. By daybreak, there will not be a man left in his household. That was David's plan. Because he'd done all this, kept him safe, protected his stuff, and now he's going to insult me? No, sir. So David gets his men together. He says he has about 400 soldiers with him. And they begin to march back towards Nabal's house. And while they're on the march, Nabal has a wife named Abigail who hears his response to what David said. And now she knows he's going to come back and he's going to be angry. He's probably going to kill us. So she gets together a bunch of supplies and takes off on her own to go meet David and to give him supplies. And she does. David's grateful, and he says, oh, the Lord protect you because you kept me from doing something horrible. Because he was going to take vengeance into his own hands. That was his plan. But thankfully, she came and met him and satiated that, and he realized he was in the wrong. He said, God will repay. I don't need to deal with this. God deal ever so harshly with Nabal. So David and his men, they go off. Abigail returns home. Next night, her husband drinks a little too much. He's a little drunk. So she's like, I'm not going to tell him what I did. It won't end well. The next day, though, he sobers up. And she tells him, hey, I gave David the supplies he wanted. And he gets angry. He gets angry there. And if I had someone who could read 1 Samuel 25, verses 32 through 38.
Then David said to Abigail,
Oh, yeah. No, you're good. This is, yeah, you're good.
blessed be the Lord God of Israel, who sent you this day to me. And blessed be your discernment, and blessed be you, who have kept me this day from bloodshed, and from avenging myself by my own hand. Nevertheless, as the Lord God of Israel lives, who has restrained me from harming you, unless you come quickly to meet me, surely there would not have been left to Nabal until this morning's light, as much as one man. So David received from her hand what she had brought him, and said to her, go up to your house in peace. See, I have listened to you and granted your request. Then Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, he was holding a feast in his house, like the feast of a king. And Nabal's heart was merry within him, because he was very drunk. So she did not tell him anything at all until the morning time. But in the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him these things, and his heart died within him, so that he had become as a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal.
Yeah. So there it is. Nabal out here having a party, a little drunk. The next day, she tells him everything. He gets heart struck. 10 days later, he's dead. Yeah, the Lord struck him down for what he did. Again, showing God will repay the evil that is done to David. And the same with us. God will repay the evil that's done to us. We don't need to do it. Let God be the avenger that he wants to be. God has a lot of vengeance. Let him take it. We don't need to. And that's what happened here in this story. And the rest of this chapter continues because David is still traveling. And now, all of a sudden, Abigail comes riding up with her maids. And whenever she gets to him, she says, "My husband's dead. Take me as your wife." So David marries her. That's how that story ends. She becomes David's third wife he has. Because as we remember, he was married to Saul's oldest daughter, Michal. And it's interesting here, she was given to somebody else. She didn't go on the run with David. She stayed in Saul's household, and she was married to somebody else. But then we see David has a second wife, Ahinoam of Jezreel, and then he marries Abigail, the widow of Nabal. And as we look through, as you read through on your own time, and I recommend you do, because I'm just giving brief summaries, anytime she's brought up, it's usually Abigail, who was the wife of Nabal, or like Nabal's widow or something. Just to remind everybody that she was married to Nabal first, but God struck him dead because of his lack of obedience. But then we have the story of David being chased in the water bucket that we read, where he could have killed Saul again, but he didn't. And Saul says, "Come home." David says no. He's still on the run. And now it's been a while of David running. And he finally, the mind starts to go, I can only run for so much time. I can only be on the run for so long before I have to take matters into my own hands and do something. So that's what he decides to do. As we look at chapter 27, which is where we're at now, if you are following along, David returns to the Philistines again, which is always interesting to me because he's killed Philistines many a times, but yet they're still always able to host him whenever he needs to. So he goes back to the Philistines now and says, "Hey, I'm being hunted by Saul. I need a place to hide. Can I stay here with you?" And the king of the Philistines, the king of Gath, gives him a city and makes him one of his advisors, bodyguards, generals, what have you. So now, 15. Oh, I only have 15 minutes left. We'll go quickly. Sorry, this is always interesting stuff. But David is now employed by the Philistine army. And it's interesting, he's given the town, and it's found in 1 Samuel 27, 6 through 12. We're not going to read it because we gotta get on to the big thing that I wanted to talk about. But he's given this town and becomes a Philistine general pretty much. And it's interesting, it says as he goes on raids like the Philistines would, but he attacks the people like the Amalekites, the Moabites, the Ammonites. He attacks all these people that are Israel's enemies. He'll get all of their stuff that he wins in the fight, bring it to the king and say, "I got this from raiding the Israelites of Judah." It says, "I raided Judah," or "I raided like these other Israelite towns, and this is what I got." He's lying. But he's protecting Israel, again, using his position as a Philistine to protect Israel during this time. Even then, that's his goal. And it says he becomes a prominent member of the king's court. He becomes the king's chief bodyguard at this time. And now, the Philistines are coming to war again with, you guessed it, the Israelites and Saul. This is a common theme of Philistines and Israelites. They go to war a lot. But they're coming to go to war again against Saul. And Saul, can anyone guess what Saul's reaction to this is? Anyone? Scared. Fear. Get that. Saul is afraid. We've talked about this. He's always afraid because he knows, it says the Spirit of the Lord, he knows the Spirit's not with him. He doesn't get answers from God through dreams. None of the prophets give him the word of the Lord on what's going to happen. He can't inquire the Lord. None of the priests hear anything. He's trying to get an answer to God of how is this fight going to go, but he gets nothing. Complete silence is his response from the Lord. So he's scared, even more scared now. So scared, matter of fact, that he goes to a witch. I don't think he does. Oh, he knows he's in Philistines because it says Saul knows David's with the Philistines and stops hunting him because he can't get to him now. So he knows he's no longer in Israel, but I don't think he knows exactly how prominent David was. But David is marching with the Philistine army and Saul is scared. He goes to find a witch, which is interesting because it says Saul in his time as king hunted down all the witches. He drove out sorcerers, necromancers, evil deeds, false worshipers. He drove all that out of Israel, but now he's looking for one. And it says his attendants come to him and says, there's a witch at Endor who can summon the dead. So Saul's like, all right, I'm going to go see this lady because I need an answer. God's not answering me through the prophets, through dreams, through the priests. I need Samuel. He's like, I need to talk to Samuel. Samuel's been dead at this point for a while now. Samuel died a while ago, but Saul needs to talk to him. So the only thing he can think to do is to go find a witch to raise his soul from the depths of wherever to come talk to me. So Saul disguises himself. He goes to this witch and he says, can you bring forth a spirit? And she's like, yes, who do you need? He says, bring forth Samuel. And it says, she shrieks in fear as Samuel's soul comes up from the ground. She's scared. I don't think she was ready to see Samuel. I'm sure she probably conjured things, but they were probably evil spirits, not the actual soul of the person she's trying to talk to. But not this time. So she's scared now because Samuel just pops up out of the ground to her. She sees him, and now she's like, that's King Saul. He's going to kill me. So now she's scared because not only is there a holy man's spirit standing in the room with me, but now I got the king of Israel who's hunting people like me down. But Saul promises her, in the Lord's name, if you do what I want, you won't die. In the Lord's name. This man is making a deal with a witch who conjured a soul in the name of God. Saul, at this point, we see how terrible he has kind of become. How far he's fallen from the man God wanted him to be, because he conjures Samuel's soul up. So she says, all right, what do you want to know? And he says, ask Samuel what's going to happen in the battle. So Samuel, she turns to the ghost and says, and before she can say anything, he says, why am I here? What is going on? That's the first thing Samuel says is, why have you called me up? And then, so she asks, well, he wants to know what's going to happen at the battle. He says, oh, okay, I'll tell you what's going to happen. The Lord's going to do what he said. Remember when the Lord said, I've torn the kingdom away from you? Well, this time has come. It is now that the Lord is tearing the kingdom away from you. Tomorrow, you and your sons will be with me. And then he disappears. This encouraging message from God's prophet is, you're going to die tomorrow. That's what's going to happen. And then he leaves. This story always fascinates me because I always think, why? Why did this work? What is going on here? That there's some spiritual element. And I think this story shows that sometimes we neglect the spiritual realm. There are things that happen that we cannot explain. This event in the Bible is one of them. It isn't a crazy story that we read. It's not some fairy tale. It's not some trick of spirits. It says Samuel is raised here to talk to this woman. God allows this to happen, not because she had power over him or anything like that, but God allowed this because he was just telling him exactly what God had said before. There was no new information said here. All this does was confirm that Saul has gone off the deep end and God has rejected him. This whole story is scary to me because sometimes we neglect the idea that there are spiritual forces. There are, and we need to watch out for them. Because people like witches, like some of those palm readers we have today, some of that stuff, They're talking to someone. I think this witch that Saul talked to, she's not scared because a spirit came. She's scared because it's the spirit of Samuel, the Lord's prophet. She knew who Samuel was. Samuel was a pretty violent man. When we look at his past, he was a judge. He killed people. He killed a lot of people. So the fact that not only did a spirit come, but it was the spirit of the person who would kill people like her, she was terrified because she saw the Lord's power here. She's used to conjuring spirits, but usually they're evil spirits, demons, what have you, not the spirit of an actual person. And that's what she saw here. And now she gives this message to King Saul, who's terrified even more because now he knows, I'm going to die. It says he's on the floor pretty much. He laid down on the floor before Samuel's ghost. And now she tells him, get up and eat. He doesn't want to eat. He knows he's going to die tomorrow. But the story ends with her convincing him to eat food and go on his way. And he keeps his word to her. To his credit, he swore on the Lord's name, and he keeps his word here. He doesn't kill the witch who helped him. Should he have? Probably. That was what God wanted. But he doesn't do it. He goes on his way, and the next day, it's time for battle. So Saul has his army set up. The Philistines are about to get to the battlefield. And I love it too here because we see them, all of the Philistine generals are together. And they go to their king and say, hey, this David guy, he's an Israelite. During the battle, he's just going to turn on all of us and start killing us. Send him away, please, so we can do this fight. The Philistines are scared of one of their own men because they know his reputation. So the king sends David away, so David isn't present at this battle. Yeah, we're almost done here. David's not present at the battle. The battle commences. The Philistines rout the Israelite army. The army's running away. They're getting massacred. It says during one of the arrow volleys, Saul takes a hit. He's on his last leg. He sees his 3 sons, Jonathan and 2 others, killed during the fight on this Mount Gilboa. And he turns to his armor bearer and he says to him, kill me so they don't take me prisoner. I want you to run me through with your sword so they can't take me prisoner. His armor bearer is too scared to do it. So Saul takes out his own sword, and we all know what he does here. A lot of us know here. He falls on his own sword. He kills himself on the battlefield. It says his armor bearer sees that and does the same thing. And now all of Israel see their king and his 3 sons die in this fight. They flee. The Philistines start ransacking cities, taking over villages. They now pretty much own a lot of this territory because they've killed the king of Israel. And at this time, in another section of the world, David has returned back to his home that was given to him by the king of the Philistines. And wouldn't you believe it, when he gets home, it's burning. Somebody has destroyed his home. So he's mad. He gets together his army, and guess what nation it is? The Amalekites. Remember them? The people Saul should have wiped out but didn't? Well, here they're back again now, and they've attacked David and his people. So while Saul is fighting against the Philistines, David chases down this army of Amalekites, and he gets them, he catches them in the field, and they have all these prisoners, all of the people of his village and other villages around, all the supplies, all taken as plunder from their raid. David does what Saul didn't do, and he kills all the Amalekites there. It says that's the title. If we look at it, it says David destroys the Amalekites. The group that God wants Saul to punish, David punishes. And as he's punishing them, he returns home with all his stuff, and King Saul dies on the battlefield. It's an interesting time there of the contrast between them. David does what the Lord wants, and while he's doing that, Saul is finally rejected and dies on the battlefield. Next week, we're going to pick up with the anointing of King David and him returning as king. But before we do that, I've had Saul versus David up here this whole time, and I know some people would be upset if I never addressed it, so I'm going to address it here. As we look at the life of these 2 men, they can both be summed up in 3 words. Saul, you can sum him up as fear, pride, and impatience. Those are the 3 things you could sum up Saul's life as. He was always afraid, and finally as king, his fear that he always had became pride. At that time as king, he was always fearful and prideful, and he was never patient to wait, as we see. Many a times, he didn't wait. And the big one was whenever he didn't wait for Samuel. Those are his three attributes, if you will. Whenever we look at the inside of Saul, fear, pride, and impatience. And it's contrasted to David, who was courageous. He was humble. And he was patient. David showed incredible courage. David and Goliath, and in all those battles he fought, he never once worried about victory. You know why? Because God told him, I've given them into your hands. He knew when God was on his side, he didn't have to worry. The Lord was with him. Why bother being afraid? Yes, he felt fear, but he wasn't controlled by that fear. He trusted God and was courageous on the battlefield and courageous in his life. He was humble. Whereas Saul was always looking to be grandiose, he was angry because he had only killed thousands while David had killed tens of thousands. David didn't care. When Saul offered David his daughter to marry, his eldest daughter, David said, I'm just a shepherd. Why should I marry the daughter of a king? He was humble. David chose not to hurt the Lord's anointed because he knew his position. He was a humble guy, and he was patient. David waited years to become king. He waited all this time knowing that God will repay what has been done to me. I don't need to take vengeance. I don't need to be rash. I can wait because God will take care of it in the end. When we look at these two contrasts, we need to be like David. Sometimes we are more like Saul. I know in my life, a lot of times, I show a lot of fear. I can be very fearful. I can be very prideful and very impatient. Those are bad things. When we look at Saul's life, what was he rejected as king for? These three things. God doesn't want this. He wants this. And none of this is an outward thing. When we look at both Saul and David, both are described as handsome in appearance, good-looking guys. But God saw this in David. So as we go through and as just kind of think about this, a question to ponder, if you will, as some of Dad likes to do, ponder. It's a word I know I've heard him use. Is, are you fearful, prideful, or impatient? Or are you courageous, humble, and patient? Which one of these are you? Sometimes, I will say, sometimes we can be like, oh, I'm courageous and I'm patient, but man, I'm kind of prideful. It's an all or nothing. If you got one of these, you need to get it sorted out. Because these are things God hates. But God loves this. So as just kind of think about that, as which one of those do you embody? Are you courageous? Do you trust the Lord to do what he's going to say? Or are you afraid whenever things happen? Are you prideful or are you humble? Are you patient or are you impatient? That's kind of where we're going to leave it this week. Come back next week. I hope you all do. It's fun. I've been having a great time talking about history. We're going to get to see the life of David, and I'm going to give you a little precursor here. The life of David is a roller coaster, if you will, because it starts out normal. He starts doing real good, and something happens about here, and it's just a nosedive. It recovers, but it is a nosedive. The life of all the kings, matter of fact, could be summed up as this roller coaster. They all start out good, they do something bad, takes a nosedive. But we're going to go ahead and pray, have some donuts, have some coffee, buy some desserts. I know I'm going to buy some desserts right here after I get done praying. You should buy some desserts. They look good. And it helps Andrew Thomas, and that's really what this is all here for, because that's what we need to support him. He's doing real ministry work. Sometimes we think, oh, I'm not doing anything because I'm sitting in church. There are other missionaries out there. But this, supporting him financially and praying for him, that's what we need to be doing if we're not on the field. This is good. So I'm going to support this. You should too. But let's pray. Dear God, I thank you for today and this morning that we're able to gather together and just read through your history of the people of Israel leading up to Jesus, because all of this connects into one beautiful story that you have outlined of you intervening in human history to bring about the redemption of mankind. I thank you that we're all able to be here and just in this community all together. Be with our Sunday here, just the rest of our service at church, but also just the rest of all our days and our weeks as we go out from here.